My name is Fred Starr. We're here for a really one of the most, I think, challenging topics we've had this year, and that is on the reforms and initiatives in the sphere of religion that had been undertaken by the new government in Tashkent since the end of 2017. These are really significant events, as you're going to hear, and as many of you already know, of course. It's one thing simply to convey, as we've attempted to do in a manuscript which Dr. Cornell has co-authored and about which he'll be speaking. It's one thing simply to convey the initiatives that have been taken in various areas. There are a lot of them, and it's very complex. It's quite another thing to analyze them and to ask, well, where is this going? Where is it trending? Where does this lead us in the long run? And I raise that issue because Uzbekistan, as all its neighbors in Central Asia, including, by the way, need I remind you, Afghanistan is a secular state. The laws are secular laws. Afghan law is Roman law, basically, by the way. Certainly that's the case in Uzbekistan. The courts are secular. The education is secular. So this is a discussion that is taking place in the context of a society that is, in large parts of the society, deeply Muslim on the one hand, and on the other hand, a state which has distanced itself from the day-to-day affairs of religious life up to the present. That, in other words, a secular state. How you adjust this formula to reality, and in a way that preserves everyone's interests, is exactly the challenge that the new government has faced, and they've taken a lot of initiatives that we're going to hear about. So, without further ado, I want to introduce Svante Cornell. He is the author of, or co-author of, several pieces that I think we have copies of several of them over here, on the relationship of religion and the state in Kazakhstan and also in Azerbaijan. This is a topic to which I think Dr. Cornell has contributed in a very original way, in the form of a typology. How do you categorize the various types of approaches that one can have to this issue? And that typology, I'm confident, will figure in this report we're about to hear, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I should start by thanking my co-author, Jacob Zenn, who unfortunately is in Vietnam, where he spends most of his time and therefore not joining us. But he and I worked together on this piece. As Professor Starr said, this is the third in an installment of papers. Two of them are actually available right there for whoever is interested. The first one we published in the fall of 2016 on Azerbaijan, which focused both on the civic nationhood model of the country and also on the relationship between state and religion. And the second one on Kazakhstan was more specifically on the issue only of the state and religion, as is the current paper which you find before you, which will be part of an edited volume that is being produced as we speak. That also includes several other chapters that we've been presenting over the past few months on Uzbekistan, on the political reforms, judicial reforms, economic reforms, and this is, if you will, the last installment among several of these papers. So let's take a step back and ask, why have we accorded so much attention to this issue? And by the way, this is an issue which gathers relatively little attention, and even in the very busy Washington policy environment, is one that people very frequently are overlooking. Well, one factor is that in the book that Fred Starr and I just published, Long Game on the Silk Road, which looked at 25 years of US and European policies towards the region, one important element that we discovered, or at least focused on, and many others probably discovered, is that the United States has focused on many issues in its relationship with the countries of Central Asia and the Caucasus. But the fact that these countries are secular states is one that has been almost completely ignored. It features nowhere, for example, in the Freedom Support Act or any legislation related to the region, and it has not been a matter of interest to policymakers, and when it has been, it has actually been seen as something negative rather than positive, as an issue that where the U.S. has taken a stance on the policies of these states, deeming them to be repressive of individual religious freedom. And the spirit of our inquiry is a little different. It is not to say that everything is wonderful in the relationship of state and religion across this region. We are all aware of the fact that every state in this region continues to be colored by the Soviet legacy of how the state approaches society, and particularly how the state approaches independent-minded groups in society. And there has always been a tendency, whenever in doubt, if you will, to err on the side of the defensive and the restrictive measures, which may be to some extent changing in Uzbekistan. So that, I think we can all agree on that. But the point that where we find it an interest is that the countries across Central Asia and Azerbaijan across the Caspian have in common the fact that they are trying to identify a new model that is not the old Soviet atheist model, a new model of how to relate, how the state should relate to religion. They've all agreed on the importance of maintaining secular statehood, secular education and secular laws, and in the meantime they have tried with all possible means to prevent the rise of religiously based extremist ideology on their territory and among their population. Now, what I'd like to do today is not so much go into all the details of the policies, but talk a bit about the backdrop of our approach on these things, the parallel story, if you will, of how Uzbekistan has tackled this issue since independence, and then talk about what the Uzbek model is and how it has been changing in recent years. But I think the backdrop of how we in the United States and in the Western world more broadly look at this issue is actually quite important, because it has very much had an impact on the relationship between the United States and Uzbekistan. Now, if we go back a little bit in time, we'll find that in the last century, if you will, in the 20th century, secular governance in the Muslim world was largely seen as something both positive and something important. We can look, for example, at the way Kemal Atatürk, the founder of modern Turkey, was seen. He was seen as a visionary modernizer for most of the 20th century. But over time, and I think by the late 1990s already, there was a revisionist view that started gaining strength, not only on Atatürk as such, but on the very idea of secular governance in the Muslim world. Of course, this took place against the backdrop of the rise of Islamist ideology across the Muslim world, mainly in the Middle East, of course, but widespread in the rest of the Muslim world. And it led kind of to a question which is really can be summarized as, why do they hate us? And to many, the answer was that, well, maybe the Islamist ideologues hate us because we support secular regimes that oppress peaceful Muslims. In other words, that maybe we drive people into the hands of the radicals by being closely tied to secularist regimes that don't have popular legitimacy. And certainly in US policy, the events of 9/11 actually led this view to gain strength very rapidly, and in a way formed the backdrop for the freedom agenda of the Bush administration, which essentially identified the root causes of terrorism to be basically simply repression and poverty. In some combination, depending on who you talk to, these were the issues that were understood to be the causes of terrorism. Now, of course, back in the day, the academic research on radicalization was pretty primitive, I would say. It has developed very strongly in the 20 years that have passed, close to 20 years that have passed. And as I detail in the chapter for the RAND Corporation, which is actually available over there as well, this research has pointed to a number of different factors as being responsible for radicalization and for support for violent extremism. But the only problem is that repression doesn't really figure very prominently among these factors. In the general academic literature, there is really no support for the claim that repression leads to radicalization. If you talk about repression by one country against a minority group, then you start getting closer to some form of, let's call it academic correlation. Chinese against Uyghurs, Russians against Chechens, or even in Kyrgyzstan against ethnic Uzbeks. There you see how there may be a correlation. But if it's a generalized, the level of repression in society, the level of political freedom, if you will, cannot in any meaningful way be understood to be correlated to radicalization. That didn't matter for policy, of course, it's just an aside. But the point is that especially in the Central Asian context, this view of matters, this understanding really colored US policies and also European policies towards Uzbekistan in particular, but Central Asia and Azerbaijan in general. For 20 years, experts have been saying that Central Asian states, and especially Uzbekistan, are inadvertently radicalizing their population by engaging in widespread repression of religious freedom, in other words, pushing pious peoples into the arms of extremists. Now, what we can say today is that this has not happened. In fact, since 2005, there hasn't been a single act of violent extremism in Uzbekistan, while in the more liberal countries in the region, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, there has been a quite visible uptick in the problems relating to terrorism and violent extremism. Needless to say, in Turkmenistan, which is even more restricted than Uzbekistan, we don't really see that happening either. Now, this is not a defense of restrictive policies or of repression. You may be opposed or think these policies have very negative influences on society in general, on the political system, and what have you. But to say that they're a driver of radicalization simply doesn't appear to be supported by fact. So that's the US side of the story, if you will. Now, on the Uzbek side of the story is a quite different one, and a trajectory that is very telling. As I said, from in the last decade or so, there has been very little or no extremist violence in Uzbekistan. On the other hand, in the 15 years preceding, there was quite a lot of it. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Fergana Valley in particular, it was a hotbed of extremism. So how do we understand this? And I would argue that this formative experience for the newly independent state of Uzbekistan was very much a factor that colored the state's interpretation of how to handle religion, and certainly President Karimov's understanding of how to deal with this issue, which was diametrically opposed to the Western understanding of the problem. Now, one question which Jacob and I go into some detail on in the paper is why was there such a problem of extremism in Central Asia, and in particular in Uzbekistan in the late Soviet period, which clearly had nothing to do with the independent policies of the state of Uzbekistan, because it had not been created yet. And we find, and several scholars have actually detailed this, not many, but a few, that the Soviet policy on religion was much more complicated than the widely understood idea that they were just repressing religion. They were repressing religion, they were closing down mosques or turning them into wine storage areas or whatever it was they were doing. But there was also a divide and rule aspect to Soviet religious policies, just as it was in the ethnicity field, as we've seen in the Caucasus with splitting results. And that is that from the 1920s all the way up into the 1980s, the Soviet leadership was actually not only tolerating, but actually covertly supporting the rise of Salafi ideologies across the Muslim areas of the Soviet Union, which you may find counterintuitive. But if you look more deeply, maybe not, because Central Asia was, of course, the seat or the center of Hanafi Sunnism and of Sufi brotherhoods, whose underground nature, and especially I think you should say the role of Sufi brotherhoods in the 19th century uprisings in the North Caucasus, led the Soviet leadership led them to be very interested in crushing anything that had a Sufi aspect, and in general to seek to divide the general Hanafi Sunni nature of the Central Asian Muslim population, and support through the official Soviet religious institutions for alternative theological approaches, particularly Salafi ones actually, was part and parcel of this. This, I think, is a history that has yet fully to be written. Some scholars have touched on it and scraped the surface, but there's probably a lot more to be done there. This is, if you will...
Sir, just 1 second. Could you be more specific as to when this
this began already in the This began in the 1920s already with the excuse me, with the Soviet authorities welcoming a Lebanese-born person from the who was Al-Azhar trained, Al-Tarablusi by name, who had been kicked out of the Ottoman Empire because of his Salafi proclivities, and found himself in Kashgar for a number of years before being invited by the Soviet authorities to come and base himself in present-day Uzbekistan, actually. And his disciples became the people who actually ran the Soviet spiritual board for the Muslims of Central Asia, based in Tashkent, from the late 1940s onwards, when this was created in the aftermath of the Second World War. There was a single family, the Baba Khan family, that ran this institution for 3 generations of this family. Father, son, and grandson were the heads of this institution. They were all trained in the Shafi'i rather than Hanafi theology led by Al-Tarablusi. And these ideas actually led to quite an underground split in the among Islamic scholars in Central Asia. But the important part for our story, I think, is that so in a way, to sum it up, when Uzbekistan becomes independent, not only do you have 70 years of state oppression of religion, but you actually have a divisive factor into this by toleration and covert support, if you will, for the anti-Sufi, anti-Hanafi approaches to religion, which left traditional Central Asian Islam basically in tatters. And that is, I think, one of the factors that colored the approach of Uzbekistan. At the same time, this had led by the late 1980s to the emergence of radical extremist cells in the Fergana Valley, particularly in the city of Namangan. When the Soviet Union collapsed, these groups actually tried to physically take over in a very violent way the entire Fergana Valley, with a view to turning first Uzbekistan and the whole of Central Asia into an Islamic state. And President Karimov, who was only newly appointed the leader of the Soviet Republic of Uzbekistan, had to deal with this, and he dealt with it by flying down. And in Namangan, and you can actually, we have the link on the YouTube to this video, which is still online thanks to modern technology, where you see Tahir Yuldashev, the head of the what was to be the Al-Qaeda-aligned Islamic movement Uzbekistan, forcing Karimov to listen to him while he goes on a diatribe about how Uzbekistan has to be turned into an Islamic state in a very, very hostile environment that I think was, on a personal level, very formative for President Karimov's understanding of the threat that Uzbekistan faced, of course, with very weak institutions at independence. He had to deal with this at the same time as dealing with all the other elements of the transition from the communist economy to the market economy, building state institutions, creating borders, dealing with Afghanistan to the south, where the Taliban were emerging, and also, of course, with the civil war in Tajikistan. There's a lot of detail in the paper about this. I won't go into the woods, if you will. But the point is that there was a reason why the Uzbek state took a highly defensive approach towards anything that smelled like Islamic extremism. Of course, it was, as I mentioned initially, it was also done in such a way that it attracted very heavy Western criticism on human rights values. So there you have, if you will, the Western approach to this general idea of what is the cause of extremism. And in Uzbekistan, there was a fundamentally different understanding of what the causes of the problem were. For Uzbekistan, the causes of the problem were alien ideologies that were imported into the country from abroad, primarily from the Middle East and from South Asia, and keeping those out of the country by restricting religious life was the way to do that. Now, what is then the Uzbek model? Professor Starr very, should I say, humbly talks about a typology as if he had nothing to do in creating this typology, which of course we he played a very significant role in doing. It's detailed in much greater detail in the Kazakhstan paper, which is available here and online. We mention it and summarize it in this paper. The point that we're trying to do is to go beyond the simple understanding of what is secular and non-secular, because secular can mean very different things. The U.S. model of based on individual religious freedom is a model of a secular state, but so is the French model, which is based on a completely different idea, the laïcité idea being based on the notion of protecting the state and the society against religious coercion. And so we create, we look at it as a continuum in which you can have 5 different basic ideal types of how the state can relate to religion. On the one hand is the fusion model.
5 hands.
5 hands, yeah. Is the fusion model, which is the old Caesaro-Papist system as it used to be known in the European context, where religion and the state are simply fused. There is no such thing as religious minorities being tolerated. There is no independence for religion. Religion and the state are one and the same. The second point on the continuum, we call it the dominant religion model, which is a state that tolerates and accepts minorities, but you still have one particular religious understanding that is a privileged position in society guaranteed by the state. In the middle of the continuum is a U.S. model of state neutrality towards religion, which accepts all forms of religious life and promotes individual religious freedom. Then you move to the other side of the continuum. You first have what we call the skeptical insulating model, for lack of a better term, in which the state doesn't only try to promote neutrality. It's not a neutral state. It's a state that is skeptical, not hostile, but skeptical towards organized religion, and wants to maintain the autonomy of the state from any form of organized religion, and also insulate the state from religious influences. And finally, at the end of the continuum is what we call simply the hostile model, of which the Soviet Union was a very obvious example, where the state is actively opposed to any form of religion, at least nominally, and seeks to limit the role of religion. Now, it should be said that the states at the very end of the continuum that are very hostile to religion are usually motivated by a pseudo-religious ideology themselves, like communism, which means that you actually come full circle to the fusion model in which ideology and the state are actually united. For those of you interested in this typology, you can read more about it in the paper on Kazakhstan, where we introduce it. Now, as I mentioned, Uzbekistan rejected the Soviet model of a hostile approach to religion upon independence. Now, very often we view all the Central Asian states in Azerbaijan as simply remaining in some kind of heritage from the Soviet Union, that their approach to religion is one that is simply inherited. It's continuity from the Soviet system. We argue that is fundamentally not the case, that they did a lot of thinking, they did a lot of changes and a lot of reforms into how the state approached religion. And what we find is that Uzbekistan, of course, then did not create the third model, the state neutrality model, which very often you find is the implied or sometimes explicit assumption in U.S. documentation of the Commission on Religious Freedom and other organizations in the U.S. about what Uzbekistan should be doing. That is not what the system tried to do. What we find is that they combine elements of the second and the fourth model. That is, elements of the dominant religion model and elements of the skeptical and insulating model. Let me explain very briefly. Now, most obviously, it has elements of the skeptical and insulating model because Uzbek secularism takes more or less the same approach as the French system, which is, of course, the system that Kemalist Turkey also adopted, which is to try to protect the state and society from one dominant religious hierarchy, tradition, call it what you want. In France, this was Catholicism. In Uzbekistan, this was, of course, Sunni Islam, which is, by the way, where the U.S. model is different, because the U.S. did not have to deal with one dominant religious tradition which had a very strong political nature, which France did have to do, which is why they embarked on a slightly different system, and which, of course, also the secularizing societies and states in the Muslim world have to deal with. That is, from this approach, we find how Uzbekistan has sought to maintain secularism, especially in education and in the legal system. But we also argue that there are parts of the second model, the dominant religion model, and that is related to what I just mentioned, which is that at independence, religious life in Uzbekistan was not, if you will, a level playing field, at least the way the government viewed it. The way the government viewed it, domestic religious traditions had been shattered, had been destroyed by Soviet rule. And in the meanwhile, there was a massive influx of foreign religious groups, whether Muslim, Christian, or otherwise, trying to compete, if you will, for the souls of the citizens. And the sense from the Uzbek state, and this is my, if you will, not defense of the model, but I'm trying to explain what I think the model was that a sense that we have to allow, it was a protectionist model, if you will, in the sense that the Uzbek state wanted to provide space for the domestic, the indigenous religious institutions that had existed pre-Soviet and pre-colonization to be able to get restored. Essentially, to allow space to restore Hanafi, Sunni, Islamic institutions and traditions in society. For that to happen, the idea was we have to restrict the foreign religious influences. And this applied to all religions, by the way. It was not only, it was more specifically for Islam, but it was the same for Christian and other denominations. There was, if you will, a benevolent approach from the state towards traditional religious institutions, be they Jewish, be they Christian, or be they Muslim. The state supported these traditional religious institutions, but had a very skeptical and often hostile approach to any form of alien, novel religious ideas that were coming in any organized fashion from abroad. That, if you will, is a very quick summary of how we view the Uzbek model of dealing with religion, which is quite similar to many of the other states of the region. What has been changing in the past 2 years is something which is described again at length in the paper, but I'd like to draw an analogy to the other papers we have published during the spring on Uzbekistan in the area of economy, economic reform, judicial reform, political reform, which is that when you scratch the surface, you find that the things were actually changing before President Karimov died. They were rapidly accelerated, of course, when President Mirziyoyev gained power. But the seeds, if you will, of the changes we have seen were already visible in the last years of the Karimov period. And that can be summarized, I think, in the sense that after over 20, almost 25 years of a very defensive approach towards anything religious and other fields as well, political and economic field was a very cautious, very defensive approach. In the last years of Karimov, and of course much more strongly now under Mirziyoyev, there is a sense that Uzbekistan has now stabilized, has been able to succeed in countering extremism and locking extremism out of the country, and that now we have the luxury of moving from the defensive into the offensive, so to speak. And that's what we see, I think, in the field of religion, where there are a lot of things that have happened. There have been a number of decrees, presidential decrees in the area of education that have reinforced the secular nature of the education system, while at the same time creating new institutions in the religious sphere and releasing, if you will, some of the restrictions on religious life that had existed. So, for example, 90% or more of the people that were listed as extremist sympathizers by state institutions have been removed from those lists. I think 16,000 out of 17,000 people have been removed from these lists. The government has taken steps to facilitate religious life by building small neighborhood mosques. The president has inaugurated the idea of creating competitions in the recitals of the Quran, for example. Symbolic steps and real steps in order to, if you will, embrace Islam as a part of Uzbek culture. At the side of this, the Uzbek state has not given up on the idea that it will be part of defining what this Islam is going to be. Quite to the contrary, the government has been, and the president have been launching initiatives to advance forcefully a positive ideological answer to extremism. This is the notion of quote-unquote enlightened Islam that President Mirziyoyev has created, which, by the way, is created in direct reference to the environment 1,000 years ago that Professor Starr details in his book Lost Enlightenment, where religious and secular learning coexisted and flourished in the Central Asian context. And this heritage is actively being, if you will, brought back. The idea is to link what is happening today in Uzbekistan and Central Asia to this indigenous, again, domestic heritage of the region. And for this reason, the President has created several institutions, one being the Imam Bukhari International Scientific Research Center, also creating the Islamic Academy of Uzbekistan, specifically in order to counter extremist ideology, and as well as an Islamic Culture Center in Tashkent. I won't go on into the details. A lot of this is mentioned and detailed in the paper. But finally, since I've gone on for too long already, I think the question is, what does this mean? What does this mean for how we should approach religion and the state approach to religion in this part of the world, specifically in Uzbekistan? Our approach to this is quite a simple one, which is we think that there are still, across the region, problems. There are, as I mentioned initially, it's still the reflex of responding with restrictions and with restrictive measures when in doubt. But that said, we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's the basic, I think, recommendation we're making. And we see this, for example, in the way that US and European institutions approach this, as if we're not only criticizing the methods used by the governments in the region, but the very aim of what they're trying to achieve. Maybe that's not our intention, but two people in the region, two representatives of governments in the region, very clearly they ask, why is it? Sometimes they ask it loudly, sometimes they ask it publicly, very often they do so in private. Why is it that the West is against the idea that we're trying to be secular? What problem do you have? Why, if you are secular countries, why can't we be secular countries? Is there some form of Orientalism involved, that you don't think we're mature societies enough to be secular societies and modern societies like you are? Again, this is their perspective, and their perspective comes from an understanding, rightly or wrongly, that we are not only opposed, as I said, to the methods that they're using in trying to maintain secularism, but in some idea that we have been supporting moderate Islamism, as we have in certain areas, as in Turkey, when moderate Islamism and the secular state have been in confrontation with each other. We think that in spite of the problems that exist in all of these countries, the very idea, the very model that they are trying to achieve is one that is worth supporting. And that only if we express support for the goal that they're trying to achieve will they listen to us when we try to influence the methods they're using. In other words, if we want to have influence on the way they seek to achieve these goals and to reduce or to remove what we find to be the most undemocratic or the most restrictive or the most repressive elements of these policies, I think it's incumbent upon us to try to make these countries see that we actually understand what it is they're trying to achieve and that we think that that's something worth doing. Now, this is relevant in a global context because we've seen now for 20, 30, 40 years how in the Muslim world at large, the mixing of religion and politics has had disastrous results. It has been so and led to sectarian warfare in more places that you can mention. It has led to what we see happening in NATO ally Turkey these days, which is not at all a very pleasant story. And we think that at some point, increasing numbers of people across the Muslim world would realize that this mixing of religion and politics is not such a good idea. When that happens, what are the examples that they can look at? What examples in the Muslim world can they look at where there is an alternative to this mixing of religion and politics? And the only place now, with the exception of a few West African French colonies that have maintained the French system of laïcité, it is in Central Asia and Azerbaijan that you have half of the secular states in the Muslim world. So whether this model succeeds or fails actually is of global importance. And we have a stake in what happens there because it could affect whether there is an alternative to the mixing of religion and politics across the Middle East.
Thank you very much. This is an extraordinary overview. I think we're all going to rush out and check on these late Soviet Salafis. It struck me as such an astonishing development and that I did do some checking, and it's real. This is something that was occurring absolutely out of sight of any Western observers, and only now is the documentation coming forward. But this is a very tour de force. I mean, you've given us a very long view, and you've presented the current aspiration, and that's what it is. It's that it is a series of legislative acts, of presidential decrees, other forms of action. It is a statement of intention, and we will see how it works out in the future. But you've given us a very, very clear framework for understanding and following it, which leaves the floor open to your rebuttals, your comments, your questions to Svante and his absent co-author.
We'll have the rebuttals sent to Vietnam.
Yeah, that's it. No, serious. Questions? Yes, sir. Please introduce yourself. We're very glad to have you here, by the way.
Yeah,
Real pleasure to see you.
Thank you. My name is Timur Dalabayev, and I work for the Japanese University of Tsukuba. I'm here with East-West Center on a different project. Thank you very much for a fascinating, really, story about how your own vision of how secularity actually coexists with the religion in Uzbekistan, which is very interesting. But in general, your argument about the notion that secularity in Central Asia and Uzbekistan in particular, in your this talk, is on the one hand is welcomed, but on the other hand, the methods and attempts of the government to achieve it are criticized, and that actually leads to misunderstanding of what is going on is well received. And I think this is a very important issue. The question that I had was more related to your view about the most important factor which actually leads towards radicalization. Would you agree? And I agree with you that governmental pressure is not the only factor, or probably is not the factor which primarily is responsible for radicalization. But would you agree that actually the socio-economic conditions are the most important ones? And with the improvement of social and economic conditions, we can actually avoid any kind of radicalization, and that is the core issue that one has to look into. Thank you.
Now we could have a whole session on this. We've been involved on the sidelines of the World Bank's activities to try to start work on prevention of violent extremism in Central Asia. That's given me an opportunity to go through a lot of the literature, which not only the World Bank but many other academic institutions have done. And I think that there is a very mixed bag on this, even on the socio-economic issues. Because obviously, if socio-economic conditions created radicalization, the whole of India and a lot of Africa would be radicalized. That's not happening. So I think there are two schools in this. One school, there are people who are very convinced that socio-economic conditions are absolutely crucial. There are others who are much less impressed by the argument. I am not. I don't think I'm qualified to really come out one way or the other. I don't think we should ignore it, but I don't think it's that simple. I think what I take away from my cursory overview of the whole radicalization literature in the past 2 decades is that we have grossly underestimated the individual, psychological, identity, ideology issues as sources of this. Otherwise, how would you explain that there are more jihadis from Sweden than from Kazakhstan in Syria or war? And the fact that so many of these young people living in much better socio-economic conditions than their distant relatives in the Middle East, why are they going to fight and why are not?
Can I follow up on that? Just the World Bank is focused on Tajikistan in the current study. They've done actual survey work. Does any of the survey work shed light on your question?
The survey work, they're still coding the survey results, but the preliminary results don't necessarily show any correlation between that regions where you have greater levels of poverty also have greater levels of radicalization. The problem in Central Asia is also that, to a great extent, what we find is the survey results I have seen there, preliminary ones, show that the cross-border aspect is very important. Cross-border areas in Tajikistan with southern Kyrgyzstan, cross-border areas with Afghanistan are highly affected by this phenomenon. And obviously you have the whole issue of Russia, of migration. Now, one thing I think that seems to me to be relevant to say is that why do we see such levels of radicalization among Central Asian migrants in Russia and among second, third generation immigrant populations in Europe? And we have one thing in common: these people are uprooted. They are taken away from a traditional social, cultural context in which there were established religious institutions that somehow told you what was right and wrong and were, if you will, things that prevented radicalization. Whereas when they are in suburbs of secondary Swedish cities like Örebro, where our Guantanamo captive came from, or if they are in the suburbs of Samara, or Omsk, or somewhere like that, you find that these are atomized individuals, very often young men, and the refugee flows to Europe have been 90% men. The women, somehow nobody seems to care about giving them asylum. Only the young men are getting asylum in Europe. And I think this is one of the reasons that why you are seeing radicalization among them. These are, again, individuals who are out of context, don't have a normal family life very often, don't have traditional institutions, religious or cultural, that give them a context. And that creates identity issues. That creates a situation where they're looking for an alternative. They're also in an alien, culturally alien environment, and that makes it easier for the Salafi ideologists with very simple black and white definitions of the world and of right and wrong to come in and to make headway. In Central Asia as a whole, I think one big issue, and why this was such an issue in the early days of independence, is that there was, and still is, this big question: who are we? Because many identities were recent, some were Soviet creations. Let's be frank. Some of the national identities did not exist before the Soviet era, and there has been a process of state and nation building since 1991, which I think overall has been quite successful. The question is that for a lot of people, there is still this lingering issue of what is my identity? How much am I a Bukharan, how much am I an Uzbek, how much am I a Muslim? And these things are very fluid. And
Can I
sure.
try a different formulation? If we're looking back on this era in 50 years, will we say, oh, this was all a big response to secularization? The big process going on is secularization, and this is some rearguard.
Are we talking on a global level?
On a global level, and certainly within the region. And this is some rearguard, violent reaction against a ongoing process of secularization. Is that
possible?
Interesting. Yes, sir.
This is kind of a strange question. Bill Veal, President Emeritus of the U.S.-Kazakhstan Business Association. Svante, I'm looking at you and I'm thinking of Turkey. And I'm thinking of Erdogan's rise and the AKP. And I'm wondering, you're speaking very strongly about the secularization of the states and in Uzbekistan. How are the political parties, and particularly the political party that's in control in Uzbekistan now, does it have any efforts to co-opt the aspirations of Islamist reformists? There's this strain in radical Islam that it's the corrupt state that we need to create a theocracy to deal with. I'm just, there's a possibility that the ruling parties will see that we need to co-opt some of it's the Anderson, maybe legacy, if you will. And when they do that, are they exposing themselves then to something else, or not? I'm just sort of taking the long view here. And
what's the connection with Turkey, if you could?
Well, the rise of a political party that had strong modernizing Islamist streak to it.
Well, I think I'm connecting back to Timur's question. I think one thing that to me is very obvious is that the rise of political Islam cannot be seen in separation from the fact that the Saudis struck oil and started funding, by the billions and billions of dollars and their neighbors, radical religious groupings across the world. Whether you look at mosques in my home country or in the region that we're discussing, you find that very often they're built with money from the Gulf, the Imam is trained somewhere in the Gulf, and they are advancing an interpretation of religion that is very different from the one that is indigenous. And that links to your question, because even in Turkey, we have tended to see Turkish political Islam as something moderate. Very few people have looked into what the actual ideological aspects of Turkish political Islam has done, and because I have nothing better to do in the past few years, I've tried to do that. When you look at it, you find that it's actually quite extreme. The conspiracy theories, anti-Semitic, anti-Western conspiracy theories are at the heart of the very ideology of Turkish political Islam. If you look at the book written by Necmettin Erbakan, the leader of the Turkish Islamist party before Erdogan, you find that it's actually mind-bogglingly far out there. And where does this idea come from? These are not indigenous Turkish ideas. These are ideas that were imported from the Middle East, from the Muslim Brotherhood, some of which, by the way, were directly a result of German propaganda. Much of the anti-Semitism is European anti-Semitism spread by German propaganda during the Second World War to the Muslim countries, incorporated wholesale into the Muslim Brotherhood and the like, and regurgitated by modern political leaders. This is what happened in Turkey. So even there, we come back to the role of foreign alien ideologies promoting certain ideas. And whether the Central Asian states are going to be successful in preventing that inflow of ideology, it's not easy, obviously, because the world, it's harder to stop ideas. It didn't work in Turkey for the Kemalist state. By the way, the Kemalist Republic was more or less already compromised itself in 1980 when the military coup decided that they had to use Islam to counter communism. And when they allowed all the Saudi foundations to open offices and start printing presses, and that's what happened in Turkey. And that's what's not happened in Central Asia. And that's perhaps why we don't have this type of large, political movements on a religious basis. But the big question which you allude to is whether we're still, if you want to talk like an economist, are we going to see a regression towards the mean? That is religious life in Central Asia going to be more like the rest of the Muslim world? Because now if you look at polls, like the Pew polls of what people believe, anything from what their views are of other religions, the role of rationality versus revelation, many things, you find that Central Asia is an outlier. The rest of the Muslim world, whether Africa, North Africa, Middle East, South Asia, much stronger support for various ideas that Islamist ideas, whereas in Central Asia it's just not there. Is this just a result that we're only 25 years into independence? Or, alternatively, is there something in this cultural zone, which is, if you will, the Turco-Mongol-Iranian cultural zone, that is different, where nations and non-religious identities are stronger, where they are in closer proximity to Europe and European ideas, and that has rooted itself somehow, or the indigenous ideas that date from the religious freedom in the Mongol Empire. I mean, these are questions that we won't be able to answer until 25 years from now.
Further. Yes, sir.
Elchin Kaimov, visiting scholar actually from Azerbaijan. My question is, how do you think this formula postulates space?
Could you speak right into the mic?
Okay. Especially Islam in Azerbaijan, the way they treat, how it is sustainable. And for example, when they recently we had a Nardaran case, and at this time we had a very much human rights violation, and then I think how to balance these things to do with Islam, not to allow this extremism, and at the same time maybe this way is not proper.
No, your question is very relevant, and it comes down to a broader issue: is where do you draw the line of what is acceptable political speech and what is not? We in the West take it for granted that, aside from Germany, which has a history of extremism and therefore draws the line slightly differently. But most of the West, especially the United States, has this idea that as long as you're not engaging in violence or in inciting violence, then you're okay, right? You're allowed to say what you think. The Germans have a slightly different approach. They prohibit political parties in Germany, though not as much as they used to. And Hizb ut-Tahrir, for example, a Salafi organization that has exactly the same ideology as the jihadis, only they say we're not going to use violence right now, more or less, if I paraphrase their ideology, is not allowed in Germany. In most of the European countries, it is allowed because they don't engage in violence or incite to violence. Now, after what happened in the past decade in Syria, I think people in Central Asia look at us in the West and say, you people must be crazy to allow extremist ideologies that are inherently violent, whether they say that they're going to use violence today or tomorrow or sometime in the future or not. How can you allow this to happen? And you see the result. The result is what happened with all these people going to Syria, because you allow these ideologies to prosper. So you have two, again, very different views on where you should draw the line. For us, we draw the line as violence. For people in this part of the world, they draw the line at where, or in the best case, they don't always follow what they preach. They sometimes go even further, I know. But ideally, an ideal type of their understanding is that the problem is not the violence, the problem is the ideology. Now, we can all disagree on this point. Personally, I think that they have a point, that we can't just look at the violence and say that Hizb ut-Tahrir is fine and Al-Qaeda is not. Because you have, one leads to the other. And that brings us to your question more specifically, where you draw the balance, and I think we can all agree that so far, across this region, they, as I keep saying, whenever in doubt, these states have erred on the side of restrictive policies. And the question should be, can we get them to strike a different balance? Do we have the credibility in the West to influence them and how they draw, where they draw the balance? Right now, I would say we don't. We don't have the credibility because they view us either as hopelessly naive or as having some kind of malign intentions. I'll give you just one example. Last summer we were in Tajikistan, and as a part of all this I talked to a former minister, and just when we parted, having talked for an hour about issues of radicalism and so on, he said, please don't do a Munich. I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, you know, Munich, 1930s, you sold off parts of Europe to Hitler and thought he would leave you alone. Please don't sell us to the Islamic State and the jihadis in exchange for them leaving you alone. Now, this might appear as something completely absurd to us. But here is somebody who's been sitting in there and wondering, why is it that the Western people are not supporting our attempts to be secular, are criticizing us every time we try to impose some restrictions on the radicals? Maybe they're actually trying to cut a deal with the radicals. I mean, this is a thought process that went through there. And when people start having this kind of thoughts, you have to wonder, why do they? And is there something in our behavior that is leading them to these misinterpretations? And I think right now we don't have a lot of credibility in trying to influence them. Not by any stretch as much as we think we have. On Azerbaijan, let me just say one thing, which is that for Azerbaijan, this issue is more crucial than for any other state in the region. And that is because Azerbaijan, theoretically, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan could become could have a greater mix of religion and politics. It would be bad for the Jews, it could be bad for the Christians, it could be bad for the women, and so on. But they are relatively homogeneous. Azerbaijan is split with 2/3 Shia and 1/3 Sunni, more or less. Which means that for Azerbaijan, secular statehood is an existential issue. If Azerbaijan is not secular, Azerbaijan cannot exist. Because then it will go down the route of Iraq or Syria. Because the moment you say that you're going to impose some form of religious law, well, which one is it going to be? Is it going to be the Shia one or is it going to be the Sunni one? That's what the Pakistanis found after Zia-ul-Haq started introducing Islamic legislation in the 1980s, that the Shia said, wait, this is not our understanding of what is Islamic law, and because they were in the minority, nobody cared. So for Azerbaijan, this is an issue that is even more, of an existential nature than for the other countries, I would say.
Final words? One more question and then final words.
Yeah, first I want to thank you.
Coming your way.
Craig Carr, former Foreign Service. First I want to thank you, Dr. Cornell, for a brilliant exposition. The notion that the revolt in Andijan had Soviet-era roots is very enlightening to me. I think that's very interesting. I want to speak a little bit about U.S. policy. You talk about how the Turkish military supported the fundamentalists in Turkey. During the communist era, the U.S. was certainly turned at least a blind eye, if not a facilitative role, to the development of radical Islam, and certainly to the propagation of that by the Saudis. And certainly one of the great illustrations of that is in Afghanistan, where the whole Taliban movement came out of this Saudi propagation. The Arab fighters whose arrival were facilitated by our own institutions. And so, as someone who's promoted the notion of religious freedom in Central Asia on behalf of the U.S., a lot of our representations, it seems to me, are driven by what you might call fundamentalists within our own system. In other words, the American religious model is based on a kind of you do whatever you want, and radical religious beliefs were part of our heritage, and a lot of those beliefs are highly proselytizing, and they are out there, and they are the ones that we're asked to be defending, and they are often the ones who are promoting the official efforts to intercede with governments in the region to make that change. So I guess my question would be, what elements of traditional Islam do you think the Uzbeks are promoting to make this sort of secular, more resilient form of Islam that would resist both the sort of pressures from the West and the Salafist engagements?
Thank you. I mean, this is fascinating, but I think especially raising the communist era is important, because I suppose this Tajik person I talked about just now has in the back of his mind the fact that the U.S. did, sometimes for, sometimes against these type of groups. And yes, whether you look at Turkey, whether you look at Pakistan, Afghanistan, there is a history of our own involvement and our own looking the other way. And I think the late Zbigniew Brzezinski, in a weak moment, in an interview with a French newspaper, he's on the record when asked about this. Your policies in Afghanistan, the journalist asked, didn't that contribute directly to the rise of the Taliban? And he said, well, what is a few excited Muslims compared to the liberation of Eastern Europe? So yes, we have a certain history which we tend to forget. That we not only took a blind eye to these things, but we may inadvertently in some places have encouraged it, not understanding what it would lead to. I take that point and I think it's important. On what the Uzbeks are promoting, I'm not sure. I think they're promoting an idea. The content of this idea will have to be filled. But the idea is that, which I think we can sympathize with, is that the Islam, there is, to paraphrase Tayyip Erdogan, who says he says there is no such thing as moderate Islam because Islam is one. There is no difference. Now, obviously, we all know that's not true. There are many different varieties of Islam. Then the Saudi one is not, or what used to be the Saudi one. Let's hope that they're changing it into something moderate now, whatever that means. But that's not the only one. There is an indigenous tradition of Islam that is tolerant of reason, tolerant of scientific inquiry, and not the totalitarian ideology that it's been turned into by some of these modern political movements. But the big question is that we still have a country where, or all of these countries where most of the leadership are, even if they're in their younger, their 50s, they are products of the Soviet system, which means that they're on a personal level, their understanding of religion is probably not very advanced. I think those of us who have interacted in this part of the world have seen this very frequently. That they haven't been raised with an understanding of religion. This is something that has come in adulthood for most of the people who are in a senior position of government across this region. Which means that I don't think they necessarily know. They know on a conceptual level what it is they want to do. And Enlightened Islam sounds great, but what does it mean? And what are they going to teach in this Al-Bukhari Center? What are they going to specifically research on, especially as Professor Starr has mentioned, when they find out what Al-Bukhari actually said and did, well, which part of that are they going to incorporate and not? So I think that is something we'll have to watch, and that's by no means an easy question.
Well, you've presented us with a very, I think you've given us a kind of framework for following what's going to be a great adventure in the coming period, and it's really very, very useful what you've done. This paper is really good. I strongly recommend it to you to be part of the book, which will be out in a couple of months, the title of which is?
The title of the book is Uzbekistan's New Face.
Now, just a quick note, a couple of quick notes. First, the idea of Enlightened Islam. This is, Mr. Erdogan may have a point when he says, well, wait a minute, it only comes in one flavor. And what really is meant by this? And it is built on an assumption of the way things were during a golden age, an era of enlightenment, which was the subject of my book. But that was a complicated era. I mean, you had an enlightened Islam then. You also had a bunch of real skeptics. I mean, serious skeptics, not just Jewish skeptics and Christian skeptics, but Muslim skeptics. And then you had out-and-out people like Razi, the great physician, without whom there would never have been an Ibn Sina. Razi, although, by the way, born in outside Tehran, he was totally a product of Central Asia. Razi was such a skeptic that he was one of several people who wrote tracts collecting the prophecies of prophets and showing how utterly mutually contradictory they were. He said, what's going on here? Could God have created these prophets out there to totally disagree with each other? And there are 4 or 5 collections of, this was a fashionable thing for a few rather extreme people to do back then. This was in an environment of enlightened Islam. Also, Bukhari, it might have been enlightened Islam, but when he came in with the text of his collection of hadiths, he made the mistake of showing up in Nishapur, which is now on the very eastern edge of Iran, but is part of Khorasan, the big Central Asian cultural zone. He made the mistake of showing up in Nishapur, where the local hadith collectors basically took him apart. He fled. He fled back to Samarkand and to Bukhara, where he's from, obviously. it was so hot for him that he couldn't even, he went to Samarkand to defend his collection versus 8 other collections that were out there. And they basically drove him home. This was a pretty rough and tumble environment, this era of Enlightened Islam. It was also a period where all kinds of exotic stuff was being thought and done. And you wonder, are you really up for this? You know, this is conceptually it's very attractive, you know, 1,000 flowers and all that. But one never knows what that rather open approach, and hats off to them, I say, for adopting such an open approach. But what kind of things will come out amidst that environment? So that's point one that I would make. The second that I would make is that they're being extraordinarily bold in this. I mean, Bukhari, if you think what he and all the hundreds of other hadith collectors were doing, they were basically looking for an absolute basis of authority on which to which you can turn to solve all of life's problems. Text, literalism. Here it is, and here is along with the Quran, you have the sayings of the Prophet, and between the two of them, you don't really need reason, you need an understanding of the text. Well, this was where Bukhari was coming from, and I am deeply impressed with the boldness of creating a center of Enlightened Islam in the name of Bukhari. This isn't to criticize Bukhari at all. He was in many ways a heroic figure. He devoted his life to this. But there are internal tensions in the very concept, which I think you have to salute the boldness of those who have come up with the concept of a Bukhari Center for, if you will, Enlightened Islam. Now, why is that important? Because fundamentally, it seems to me, this concept that Svante Cornell has laid out so clearly, it is fundamentally civic. I mean, this is not addressing my personal faith or someone else's personal faith. It is not even addressing my familial and my village-based and my local-based faith, which might mesh very comfortably with what they're proposing, but it's fundamentally different. This is a proposal for addressing the civic dimension of religion, and I think that's a way that one might bear in mind. One might bear that in mind as a way of thinking about this as time goes on. The final point that I would make is that the non-civic parts of religious life in the entire Judeo-Christian and Muslim tradition of the, if you will, the traditions of the book, the deeply personal aspects that deal with Sufism, for example, and so many other manifestations of religious life. How are they going to fit or not fit with this new? And you know, fundamentally, Uzbekistan and most of Central Asia if you go out of the sophisticated cities, you have a very deeply traditional faith. And I remember hearing from the Mufti in Tashkent many years ago. He said, well, yeah, some of our guys do go off to the Middle East. They come back a few years later, and our local Muslims set them straight pretty fast. He was very, very confident in that. But that basically village faith in the strength of it or not strength of it, in the face of this new civic version that is coming forward, that's going to be something very much worth watching. Final point that I would raise is this, and that is, this is all going to turn on how a rising generation receives all these innovations or non-innovations, whatever however these edicts and policies that are described so well in the paper, however these are actually implemented, the question is how do the very young people, how are they going to react to this? And therefore, you know, if you want some intimation of this, that maybe we should all be on YouTube right now and listening to the latest lyrics to the latest songs coming out of Jizak and places like that, because frankly we don't know. You know, where is this going to lead? How will a rising generation who view these reforms of the last year as the beginning of a new beginning of history, how are they going to receive this? Are they going to embrace it? Are they going to assimilate it in some way? Are they going to assimilate it but change it? Or are they going to view it as them?